Engineer dared simple woman solve engine problem joke. What happened next shocked all. Sometimes the most profound lessons come wrapped in the greasiest coveralls. What Preston Montgomery discovered that Tuesday afternoon would shatter everything he thought he knew about intelligence, expertise, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people. The rumble of engines filled Murphy's auto repair like a mechanical symphony, but today, something felt different. Delilah Martinez wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of clean skin across the grime. She'd been wrestling with a stubborn alternator for 2 hours, her calloused hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. "Damn thing's being more stubborn than my ex-husband," she muttered, earning a chuckle from Rusty Peterson, the shop's veteran mechanic whose weathered face told stories of 4 decades under hoods. The afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across tools that had seen better days but still got the job done. This wasn't some fancy dealership with pristine floors and computerized everything. This was real work. Honest, dirty, necessary work that kept America's cars running. That's when the silver Mercedes pulled up outside. "Well, ain't that something?" Rusty said, squinting through the window. "That car's worth more than I make in 3 years." Delilah glanced up, immediately sensing trouble. Expensive cars usually meant expensive problems, and expensive problems usually came with expensive attitudes. She'd learned that lesson the hard way over her 12 years in the business. The Mercedes door opened with that solid thunk that only German engineering could produce. Out stepped a man in his early 40s, everything about him screaming corporate. Pressed khakis, spotless button-down shirt, leather shoes that had never seen a puddle. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight as a ruler. Behind the Mercedes, a flatbed truck was unloading a classic blue Mustang, 1967 fastback, if Delilah's eye was right. Beautiful car, but even from 20 feet away she could hear something wasn't right with the engine. There was a subtle irregularity in the idle, a hesitation that spoke of deeper problems. "Excuse me," the man called out, stepping carefully around a small oil stain. "I'm looking for the shop foreman." "That'd be me," Rusty replied, not bothering to wipe his hands before extending one. "Rusty Peterson." "What can we do you for?" The man hesitated before shaking hands, his grip brief and sanitized. "Preston Montgomery, automotive engineer with Richardson Technologies. I have a situation with my restoration project." He gestured toward the Mustang with the air of someone presenting evidence in court. "I've been working on this car for 8 months. Everything's been rebuilt to factory specifications, but there's an engine problem that's, frankly, perplexing." Delilah set down her wrench, wiping her hands on a rag. Something in Preston's tone, that careful, measured way he spoke, reminded her of professors she'd known, smart people who lived in theory but had never felt an engine's heartbeat through their fingertips. "What kind of problem?" she asked, stepping closer. Preston's eyes flicked over her coveralls dismissively. "It's quite technical." The tension in the garage shifted like barometric pressure before a storm. Delilah felt it in her bones, that familiar weight of being measured and found wanting before she'd even opened her mouth. "Technical how?" she pressed, crossing her arms. Preston pulled out a tablet, swiping through screens of data with practiced efficiency. "The engine exhibits irregular combustion patterns under load, specifically between 2,800 and 3,200 RPM. I've replaced the fuel injectors, recalibrated the ECU, tested compression ratios. Everything points to proper function, yet the problem persists." He spoke like he was reading from a textbook, each word carefully chosen to demonstrate his expertise. "I've run computational fluid dynamics models, analyzed fuel atomization patterns, even consulted with colleagues at MIT. Frankly, it's beyond what most traditional mechanics, would understand. Rusty's jaw tightened. Most traditional mechanics, huh? No offense intended, Preston said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. It's just that modern automotive engineering requires a deep understanding of thermodynamics, materials science, electronic fuel management systems. This isn't something you can diagnose with a stethoscope and wishful thinking. Delilah felt heat rising in her chest. She'd heard variations of this speech before, from dealership service managers, from customers who assumed her gender meant incompetence, from men who thought grease under fingernails somehow indicated limited intelligence. "You know what's funny," she said quietly. "Every time someone tells me something's too technical for me to understand, it usually turns out to be something I've fixed a dozen times before." Preston's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "I appreciate your confidence, but this is a complex engineering problem. I've got 8 years of automotive systems training, 3 degrees, and access to diagnostic equipment that costs more than this entire shop. And yet here you are," Delilah observed. The comment hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Around the garage, other mechanics had stopped working to listen. Joe Martinez paused mid-torque on a transmission. Eddie Walsh looked up from an oil change. Even old Frank, who'd been pretending to organize tools, was paying attention. Preston's face flushed slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm simply being realistic about the level of expertise required." "Tell you what," Delilah said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "How about we make this interesting? You give me 30 minutes with your car, just 30 minutes, and if I can't at least identify the problem, I'll admit you're right. I'll tell everyone in this garage that some problems are just too technical for simple folks like us." "And if you can?" Preston asked, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Then you owe every person in this shop an apology. And maybe, just maybe, you learn something about assumptions." Preston looked around the garage, seeing the expectant faces, feeling the weight of his own words. 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Word spread through Murphy's Auto Repair like wildfire through dry grass. Within minutes, what had started as a simple interaction between customer and mechanic had evolved into something much bigger, a test of pride, expertise, and everything the working class had been told about their place in the world. "You sure about this, Del?" Rusty whispered, pulling her aside while Preston inspected his Mustang with obvious anxiety. "That's a lot of sophisticated equipment under that hood." Delilah nodded, though her stomach churned with a familiar cocktail of determination and fear. She'd been doubted before, but never quite so publicly. Never with this many witnesses. If she failed here, it wouldn't just be her reputation on the line. It would confirm every stereotype Preston and people like him carried about blue-collar workers. 30 minutes, she repeated, more to herself than to Rusty. Across the garage, Preston was explaining the situation to a small crowd that had somehow materialized. Mrs. Chen, waiting for her Honda's oil change. Tommy Rodriguez, dropping off his pickup after work. Even Betty from the diner next door had wandered over, drawn by the unusual commotion. "The diagnostic readings are absolutely perfect," Preston was saying, showing his tablet to anyone who'd look. "Fuel pressure, timing, compression, everything's within factory specifications. But under load, between 2,800 and 3,200 RPM, there's this hesitation, this loss of power that shouldn't exist." Eddie Walsh shook his head. "If Dell can't figure it out, it can't be figured out. That woman's got magic in her fingers." "Magic?" Preston scoffed. "This is precision engineering, not witchcraft. The problem requires systematic analysis, not intuition." That word, intuition, landed like a slap. As if everything Delilah had learned through years of experience, through listening to engines speak their problems, through developing the kind of diagnostic sense that couldn't be taught in any classroom, was somehow lesser than Preston's computer models. "Clock starts now," Delilah announced, approaching the Mustang. The crowd pressed closer, forming a semicircle around the classic car. The afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, making the blue paint shimmer like deep water. This was more than just a mechanical problem now. It was David versus Goliath, experience versus education, heart versus head. Preston checked his expensive watch. 30 minutes, starting now. Delilah popped the hood, and immediately the Mustang's engine bay revealed itself like a familiar book. Clean, meticulously organized, every component rebuilt to showroom perfection. Too perfect, maybe. Sometimes the cleanest engines were the trickiest to diagnose because all the obvious problems had been eliminated. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Every engine had its own voice, its own rhythm. This one was trying to tell her something, but the message was subtle, hidden beneath layers of precision engineering and pristine restoration. "Okay, sweetheart," she thought, placing her hand on the valve cover. "What's your secret?" 29 minutes remaining. Delilah's hands moved across the engine bay like a detective examining a crime scene. Every wire, every connection, every component told part of a story. The question was, which part was lying? "She's just randomly touching things," Preston muttered to the growing crowd. "There's no systematic approach here, no methodology." But Delilah wasn't randomly touching anything. Her fingers traced the fuel lines, feeling for inconsistencies in temperature or vibration. She checked the distributor cap, the spark plug wires, the air intake system. Everything felt right, looked right, seemed right. "Try starting her up," she called to Rusty. The Mustang's engine turned over with a healthy roar, settling into what sounded like a perfect idle. Delilah leaned in closer, her ear near the engine block, listening to the symphony of precisely timed explosions happening hundreds of times per minute. "Sounds good to me," someone from the crowd commented. "That's the problem," Preston said. "It sounds perfect, runs perfect at idle and low RPMs. The issue only manifests under specific load conditions." 23 minutes remaining. Delilah straightened up, wiping her hands thoughtfully. "Rusty, you got your scanner handy?" "Thought you didn't need fancy equipment," Preston commented, unable to hide his smugness. "Sometimes the fancy equipment tells you what the problem isn't," Delilah replied, connecting the diagnostic scanner to the Mustang's computer system. "Just because I can work without it doesn't mean I'm too proud to use it when it's helpful." The scanner's display lit up with data streams, fuel trim numbers, oxygen sensor readings, ignition timing, air-fuel ratios. Everything looked textbook perfect, just as Preston had claimed. "See?" Preston pointed at the screen. "All parameters within normal range. The computer sees no problems." 18 minutes remaining. Delilah stared at the data, her mind working through possibilities. Preston was right. Everything looked perfect on paper. But engines weren't just collections of data points. They were mechanical hearts with quirks and personalities that couldn't always be captured by sensors and computers. "Rev it up to 3,000 RPM, she instructed Rusty. The engine's note changed, climbing higher, and there, just for a split second, Delilah heard it. A tiny hesitation, so brief it might have been imagination. But she'd been listening to engines for too long to doubt her ears. "There," she said, pointing though nobody else could see what she was indicating. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Preston asked, leaning closer. "The miss. Right at 2,850 RPM. Just a tiny one. But it's there." Preston shook his head. "The diagnostic equipment shows no misfires." "Because it's not a traditional misfire," Delilah said, her voice gaining confidence. "It's something else entirely. 15 minutes remaining. 12 minutes remaining." Delilah suddenly stopped what she was doing, straightening up with a look that Rusty recognized, the same expression she got when solving a particularly stubborn puzzle. Her eyes weren't on the engine anymore. They were distant, thoughtful. "Preston," she said slowly, "tell me about your restoration process. Step by step. What does that have to do with humor me? You've got nothing to lose, right?" Preston sighed, consulting his tablet. Complete teardown, every component cataloged and photographed. Engine block machined to exact specifications, new pistons and rings, rebuilt transmission, restored suspension components, rewired electrical system. "New everything," Delilah interrupted. "Brand new parts throughout?" "Of course. I wanted it perfect. Even the timing chain, especially the timing chain, double roller, heavy duty, rated for high-performance applications." 8 minutes remaining. Delilah knelt down beside the engine, running her fingers along the timing chain cover. "What about the timing chain tensioner?" "New as well. High-performance hydraulic tensioner, far superior to the original mechanical design." "Hydraulic," Delilah repeated, and something clicked into place like a wrench finding its proper bolt. "Rusty, help me get this timing cover off." "Del, you've only got 7 minutes left," Rusty warned, but he was already reaching for tools. "Sometimes 7 minutes is all you need," she replied, loosening bolts with practiced efficiency. Preston stepped closer, genuinely curious now despite himself. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the difference between theoretical perfection and practical reality," Delilah said, lifting away the timing cover to reveal the timing chain and tensioner assembly beneath. The crowd pressed closer, trying to see what she was looking at. Even Betty from the diner was craning her neck, though she probably couldn't tell a timing chain from a bicycle chain. 5 minutes remaining. Delilah peered closely at the hydraulic tensioner, then grabbed a flashlight from Rusty's toolbox. The beam illuminated the tensioner mechanism, and there, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a tiny weep of oil. "There's your problem," she announced. Preston squinted at the component. "I don't see anything wrong." "The tensioner's bleeding pressure," Delilah explained, pointing with the flashlight beam. "See that tiny bit of oil? Under normal conditions, it holds tension fine. But when you hit that specific RPM range where torque and vibration combine just right, it can't maintain constant pressure. The timing chain gets just loose enough to throw off the timing by a fraction of a degree. 3 minutes remaining." That's impossible," Preston stammered. "The tolerances on modern hydraulic tensioners are designed for modern engines," Delilah finished. "But this is a classic engine with classic vibration patterns. Sometimes new isn't better. Sometimes it's just different." 1 minute remaining. The garage fell silent except for the gentle rumble of the Mustang's engine. Preston stared at the tiny oil weep that Delilah had identified, his tablet hanging forgotten in his hand. The crowd watched him process what he was seeing, what it meant. "But the diagnostic equipment should have caught a timing issue," he said weakly. "Should have," Delilah agreed, "if it was a big enough timing variation to register. But this is just a few degrees, just in that narrow RPM band where everything lines up wrong. Your fancy computer doesn't see it because it's looking for big problems, obvious problems. Sometimes the biggest problems come in the smallest packages." "Time's up." Rusty checked his watch and grinned. 29 minutes and 43 seconds. "I'd call that a win." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Betty whooped like her team had just won the World Series. Eddie slapped Joe on the back so hard he nearly knocked him over. Mrs. Chen clapped politely. though she still wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. But Preston wasn't celebrating. He was staring at that tiny oil leak like it held the secrets of the universe. His entire worldview, everything he'd been taught about expertise, about education, about the hierarchy of knowledge, was crumbling like old gasket material. "How did you know?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the celebration around them. Delilah wiped her hands on her coveralls, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. "Hydraulic tensioners are great in theory, but I've seen them fail before in classic applications. Not often, but enough times to recognize the symptoms. When you said everything was perfect except for that specific RPM range, and when I heard that tiny hesitation, well, experience has a way of connecting dots that computers can't see." Preston looked around the garage. Really looked, for the first time since he'd arrived. He saw tools that had been cared for across decades, workbenches worn smooth by thousands of repairs, men and women whose hands told stories of problems solved and challenges overcome. "I owe you all an apology," he said suddenly, his voice carrying across the garage. "I came in here with assumptions about intelligence, about expertise, about what knowledge looks like. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong." The celebration quieted as people listened. "Delilah," Preston continued, turning to face her directly, "you just taught me more about automotive diagnosis in 30 minutes than I learned in 4 years of engineering school. Not because what I learned was wrong, but because I never learned how to listen." Delilah nodded, accepting the apology with the grace of someone who'd been underestimated so often that vindication felt almost routine. "So," she said with a slight smile, "want me to fix your tensioner?" 3 hours later, the Mustang purred like a contented cat. The new mechanical tensioner, sourced from Rusty's collection of obsolete parts that weren't obsolete at all, just forgotten, had eliminated the timing variation completely. Preston had insisted on staying for the entire repair, watching every step with the fascination of someone discovering a new language. "Hand me that 9/16, Delilah said, and Preston knew exactly which wrench she meant now. "I can't believe I spent 8 months chasing ghosts," he admitted, tightening the last bolt on the timing cover. "All those computer models, all that diagnostic data—" "Wasn't wasted," Delilah assured him. "You eliminated 100 other possibilities. Sometimes you need to rule out everything else before you can see what's really there." The garage had returned to its normal rhythm. Mrs. Chen had picked up her Honda, Eddie was closing up his bay, and Betty had gone back to the diner with a story she'd be telling for weeks. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere, like the pressure change after a thunderstorm. Preston stepped back to admire their work. "How much do I owe you?" "Parts and labor comes to $240, Rusty said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "But I figure the education was worth something extra." Preston pulled out his checkbook, then paused. "Actually, I'd like to make this interesting. What would you say to a partnership?" Delilah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of partnership?" "I've got access to diagnostic equipment, technical resources, manufacturer contacts. You've got something I clearly lack, the ability to hear what engines are actually saying. What if we combined both approaches?" It was Rusty who spoke first. "You mean like a consulting arrangement?" "More than that," Preston said, his excitement building. "I'm thinking about classic car restoration as a specialty business. There's a growing market for it, people with money who want their vintage cars properly restored, not just made to look pretty. But they need mechanics who understand both the old ways and the new technology." Delilah considered this. "You'd want to work here? In this shop?" Preston looked around the garage, at the oil stains on the concrete, the hand-lettered signs, the tools that had been fixing cars since before he was born. 6 hours ago, this place had seemed beneath him. Now it felt like home base for something important. "If you'll have me," he said, "I've got a lot to learn about the difference between knowing and understanding." Delilah extended her hand, still stained with grease despite multiple washings. Preston shook it without hesitation. "Welcome to Murphy's Auto Repair," she said. "Try not to wear white." 6 months later, Murphy's Auto Repair looked much the same from the outside. Same weathered sign, same oil-stained parking lot, same honest promise of reliable work at fair prices. But step inside, and the changes were unmistakable. In one bay, Delilah worked alongside Preston on a 1969 Camaro, their combined expertise having attracted classic car enthusiasts from 3 states. Preston's diagnostic equipment hummed quietly next to Rusty's time-tested tools, technology and experience finally working in harmony. "Compression readings look good," Preston announced, studying his tablet. "Sounds healthy, too," Delilah added, listening to the engine with the same intensity she'd always brought to her work. Whatever was wrong with this one, it wasn't mechanical. The partnership had surprised everyone, including themselves. Preston had proven surprisingly adept at learning the hands-on aspects of mechanical work, while Delilah had discovered that diagnostic technology, properly applied, could save hours of trial-and-error troubleshooting. "Del, you got a minute?" Rusty called from the office. "Reporter from the local paper wants to talk about the shop's expansion." The newspaper article would run the following week with the headline, "Unlikely Partnership Revs Up Local Business." It would mention the shop's growing reputation for classic car restoration, the waiting list of customers, the apprenticeship program they'd started for young mechanics interested in vintage automobiles. But it wouldn't capture the real story, how a moment of arrogance had transformed into mutual respect, how assumptions about intelligence and expertise had crumbled under the weight of practical wisdom, how 2 very different people had discovered that the best solutions often came from combining different kinds of knowledge. Preston hung up his coveralls at the end of the day, still amazed at how much his life had changed. His colleagues at Richardson Technologies had been skeptical at first, but even they couldn't argue with the results. Classic car restoration was becoming a legitimate specialty, and Preston was building a reputation as someone who understood both the engineering principles and the practical realities. "Same time tomorrow?" Delilah asked, washing her hands at the industrial sink. "Wouldn't miss it," Preston replied. "Still got a lot to learn about listening." Outside, the sun was setting over Murphy's Auto Repair, painting the sky the same shade of blue as that 1967 Mustang that had changed everything. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the humblest packages. Delilah's story reminds us that expertise isn't always found where we expect it, and wisdom often wears work clothes and grease-stained hands. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked or where you worked? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you proved the doubters wrong. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. What did Delilah's triumph mean to you? Let us know where you're watching from, and remember, never judge someone's capabilities by their coveralls.